Today we'll be discussing the new Netflix movie Beverly Hills Cop, Axel F, and we'll be discussing meniscal tears. This is Doctor versus Comedian. I'm Dr. Asif Doja, and this is the Doctor of Laughs.
Not a real doctor.
Ali Hassan. Every episode I pick a topic for Ali from comedy and entertainment, and I question him about it. Then Ali picks a topic from medicine and health and grills me on that topic. Today we'll be discussing Eddie Murphy's new Netflix movie, Beverly Hills Cop, Axel F. Then we'll be discussing meniscal tears. Now, how are these two topics connected, Ali? I don't know if you saw this that I put in our documents.
I have
Why
no
these two
idea.
are related?
No, I've got no idea.
So Eddie Murphy tore his meniscus rolling over in bed.
Ah, that's our future.
I know. So it does happen to athletes, but it also happens when you're older. Eddie Murphy is 63, I believe. So that's how these are connected. But we do have a lot to talk about today. So I think we should get started right now. Ali, let's get right into things because I think we are not going to do a huge deep dive retrospective into Eddie Murphy. I think want to talk more about Beverly Hills Cop and the series of movies. But it's hard to talk about those movies without talking about what a huge sensation Eddie Murphy was in the early 80s, right?
You can't. I mean, I think for people of a certain age, maybe a little younger than, like Eddie Murphy was their Richard Pryor, right? So Eddie Murphy was influenced by Richard Pryor hugely, as most comedians of the 80s, 90s, 70s would have been even. But he was like Richard Pryor for maybe. He was like the guy. His comedy specials, Raw and Delirious, are things that I don't think they've fully stood the test of time, but yeah, he was just a massive, massive star, and he was ready for stardom at age 21. It was wild. He was on SNL. He was on everything. And as soon as he started doing movies, 48 Hours, another 48 Hours was the sequel.
It was later, yeah.
48 Hours and Trading Places, I remember just anticipating them with so much excitement. And they both delivered, I thought. They were great. He was in these, buddy movies where he was a great sort of collaborator. He worked well with different types of people, whether it was Dan Aykroyd or Nick Nolte and another 40 years. And then the people, he was more of a solo act in Beverly Hills Cop too, but still he worked well opposite these other like insane villains and goofy cops and all the rest of it.
Yeah. So let's talk a bit about where he was at this time. I think you kind of set the stage nicely. You know, as you said, he started listening to comedy albums, a lot of Richard Pryor when he was a teenager, and then he wanted to become a comedian. But it's funny, as a kid, he would imitate lots of characters, do lots of different kind of personalities, because his acting hero was Peter Sellers. So I didn't know that till I started doing some research for this. So very interesting. And you can see, again, if you fast forward to the Nutty Professor and the clumps and all the things that he does, right? People are like, what? Why is he doing this? This is like the hardcore Eddie Murphy comedian. Now he's doing this stuff. He loved Peter Sellers, man. That's what Peter Sellers was. He was a character actor to the extreme, right? Other influences, Bill Cosby, Red Fox, Robin Williams, and then, of course, some people who weren't comedians, Muhammad Ali, Bruce Lee, Charlie Chaplin. I mean, really, he likes entertainers. It's quite clear. Very interesting. I don't know if you remember this controversy. Well, Bill Cosby, kind of got angry at Eddie Murphy for, swearing so much and using such questionable language and topics in his stand-up. And I'm like, yeah, okay, Bill Cosby, why don't you shut up? God damn it. This is like in the 80s, and now, you see, okay, well, who came off better in this whole story? Definitely Eddie Murphy. And then you talked about him on SNL. I mean, I remember seeing him on SNL. He was, the best thing. There was a 5-year period where Lord Michaels left the show. And then I like those years because that's when me and my sister would watch it all the time. But Eddie Murphy was easily like the star on it. Rolling Stone in 2015 ranked the top SNL cast members. They ranked them all, everyone who's ever been on the show. And Eddie Murphy was ranked second behind John Belushi. What do you think of that, Ali?
Yeah, John Belushi was something. He was a real force. I see that. I remember when he was in a sketch, it was like, all right, Belushi's in a sketch. I remember when he would do the Blues Brothers with Dan Aykroyd. Some people just have this insane charisma when they're on stage, this incredible confidence that just cannot be taught. And John Belushi truly was something. I think it's up for debate if he was better than Eddie Murphy. And I'm sure in that top 10, there's a bunch of people who,
you could move people up.
You could
Kristen
move
Wiig,
people
Will
up.
Ferrell, Martin Short, I'd put up there.
I'm willing to accept that. I think it's still a great, feather in Eddie Murphy's cap to be number 2 with all the talented people who came through Saturday Night Live over the years. I'll accept it. It.
I wouldn't. I put him as number 1.
Oh,
but
okay.
It's just me. I think John Belushi, as you said, it's more because he's a force of nature. That's like a good way to put it. And he comes on screen, he commands. But I don't know. I think
most of that was cocaine fueled anyway. Artificial enhancements.
Yeah, and I think the fact there's also a bit of lost potential, right, because of his death. So anyway, just my opinion. As you said, 1982, he made his big screen debut with Nick Nolte in 48 Hours and Trading Places, then subsequent to that with Dan Aykroyd. Do you have a preference out of those 2 movies, Ollie?
I would say Trading Places.
Yeah, me too. I'd probably say that. Though 48 Hours is a good movie. I haven't seen it in years. I've seen that. I've seen another 48 Hours, but I haven't seen them in so long. But Trading Places, I think, yeah, it was a lot of fun.
I remember feeling palpable anger about those 2 old, wealthy white brothers just using, I think like this movie made me more socialist or something. I really felt so angry that these 2 brothers would just use people over a bet. You remember that? I'm sure I'm not spoiling anything, but it was just all a $1 bet. So they said, care to make a friendly wager? And then you never find out till the end. It's like it was for $1. They ruined people's lives with this bet that a black man could not make it as a wealthy person or whatever their whole thing was. It's crazy.
Now, in the early 80s, like we said, Eddie Murphy was huge, absolutely huge. All my friends had his albums. We'd watch him on Saturday Night Live. It was huge. And Ollie, I don't know how much he remembers this. He was a huge fan. He actually got me more turned on to Eddie Murphy. And you probably don't remember this, Ollie, it's such a weird juxtaposition. Ollie would come to visit, and I would have these little like Smurf figurines, and Ollie would like recite, like he would take a Smurf and he'd have him recite like Eddie Murphy's stand up. Like, it's like
through the Smurf,
and I'm like, oh my gosh, so inappropriate. I don't know. It was really funny. Like I said, you probably don't remember, but I totally remember that.
I don't remember that. A lot of crap's come out of my mouth over the years that I just once it's out, it's gone.
So I remember when Beverly Hills Cop came out, it was huge. The soundtrack was huge. It was, I mean, I bought that soundtrack. It was so good. For Axel F, of course, Harold Faltermeyer, Glenn Fry's The Heat Is On, Neutron Dance by the Pointer
first
Sisters.
2 with my kids, by the way. I watched the first 2 with my kids. And by the 5th time that song comes on, right? That actually my son, my 9-year-old, was like, this song again? That's part of the song.
You don't get it, man.
That's what they do. Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk a bit about the background of the first one, and then we'll eventually get to talk about the new one that just came out a few weeks ago on Netflix. So in 1977, Don Simpson, who's a famous producer, Don Simpson, Jerry Bruckheimer.
Simpson and Bruckheimer was the big duo. Yeah.
They made tons of blockbusters. And he had an idea of a movie about a cop from East LA who's transferred to Beverly Hills. So East LA, of course, rough and tumble area of Los Angeles, and then transferred to Beverly Hills. And then Jerry Bruckheimer, who's a producing partner, was like, yeah, that sounds good. And then they tried to workshop it with different actors. So Mickey Rourke was offered it, and then different directors. So Scorsese was offered it. David Cronenberg was offered it. They turned it down. And then it was going to be Stallone, who I think was going to write it and direct it. And he, I guess, rewrote the whole thing, took away all the humor, and just made it into a standard action movie. And he said, like, the opening scenes of Beverly Hills Cop, which is like the murder that occurs in Detroit, which there's an action scene in the beginning, and then his friend gets murdered. That's the beginning of the first Beverly Hills Cop. It would have looked like Saving Private Ryan, like the storming of the beaches of Normandy, like it would have been super violent. And so then I guess 2 weeks before filming, he dropped out because it wasn't working out. And he used those ideas for the movie Cobra, which was 1986. Did you ever see Cobra? I never saw it.
Cobra with Stallone? Sure,
Yeah.
he did.
Yeah. Anyway, it's apparently an unusual,
kind of forgettable.
Film. Yeah, exactly. But
Yeah.
Anyway, so
compared to like Rambo and Rocky, I mean, Cobra just sort of falls off.
Exactly. So they also offered the role of Axel Foley to Richard Pryor, Al Pacino, James Caan, and Harrison Ford, and everybody
Good Lord.
turned it down. And so eventually they had this final shooting script, but Eddie Murphy revised it. And there's a great oral history of Beverly Hills Cop, which we'll link to. It's on The Ringer. And his co-actors just said he was amazing. Like they would just like, they're like, we need something for this scene. He goes away, comes up, and it just takes off. It really is his improv.
It's an interesting comment on, your lead can shape your movie into something completely different and you'd have no idea, right? As you're saying, Sylvester Stallone, dramatic. He's making it more dramatic with his rewrites, removing the humor, and then Eddie Murphy probably injecting even more humor than the writers intended with the script, right? Just a whole other thing. It's so interesting where a movie can go when you give the lead some sort of leeway in that. And not everybody does that.
So this movie was huge. It made over $230 million at the U.S. box office. So it was the highest grossing film of 1984, the highest grossing comedy of all time, and the highest grossing R-rated film of all time. This is if you adjust for inflation, right? That's how we often look at movies now, is you adjust for inflation, because it's not fair, right, to compare dollars from like 40 years ago. So it would have made $730 million approximately in 2024. So it was everywhere. Like I said, the soundtrack was everywhere. Again, Harold Faltermeyer made Axel F, this theme that your son was like getting annoyed at. It's also that whole synthesizer based music was just becoming super popular around.
Yeah, a little bit of trivia for you, Asif, which you know nothing about because you haven't seen Top Gun, but the Top Gun anthem also made. It's also, synth pop, also made by the same guy, Faltermeyer.
Exactly.
That means nothing.
No, listen, I've heard that, and of course I've seen Top Gun Maverick. I just never saw the first Top Gun. I know it's funny. I've seen so many movies, but there are a few. I should make a list of the classic movies that I've never seen. I've never seen The Big Lebowski.
And then everyone should write in and berate you for not having seen them.
Top 10 movies I've never seen. So anyway, it was huge. What did your family think about the first Beverly Hills Cop? Let's start with that one first.
Yeah, so, this is the risk. Like, our family watched Back to the Future together, and I just watched my children drop off at different moments of the film. It just wasn't... You can't remove the fact that I was already in love with Michael J. Fox from Family Ties. And it's him doing this movie, and we knew him. You know what I mean? It's the same thing with Beverly Hills Cop. It's Eddie Murphy, guys. It's Eddie Murphy. And they're like, who? Like, they don't have any connection to Eddie Murphy. So it's really about the movie to grab you in. And I thought Back to the Future would. It didn't.
I'm embarrassed to know your kids, man. Come on. Back to the Future is probably a perfect movie. And little fun fact, we'll do it when it's the 50th anniversary of Back to the Future, which is next year. We'll do a whole episode on it.
Yeah.
We're further away from 1985 than 1985 was to when Marty went back in time to see his parents.
Yes.
So think about that for a second.
Well, you're going to be at my place soon, so you can tell my kids to their face how much they embarrass you. And I hope you will. Anyway, a Beverly Hills Cop 2, look, the 9-year-old doesn't have the the attention span for much. He'll watch for a bit and then he'll start playing with a Rubik's Cube or some Lego or just drift off. And we're like, what the, dude, can you just please, come on, you know? So I think overall they did enjoy the first one. I think overall they did. My older son fell asleep with 20 minutes left. It was just a long day for him. So I don't think they're the right barometer for if this movie is good or not. It's a fantastic movie. It's very, very entertaining.
I'm glad, because you obviously just saw it last week again. So I'm glad that you think it holds up.
I think it holds up for sure. For sure.
And I rewatched several scenes from the movie, and I thought, oh my gosh, it was pretty funny. And then a few years later, he goes on to do Beverly Hills Cop 2. This was directed by Tony Scott. And when I was watching some clips online, I'm like, this movie, Beverly Hills Cop 2, looks amazing. Who directed this? And of course, it's Tony Scott. So Tony Scott is Ridley Scott's brother. What movies did he direct? You might recall one, Top Gun, which we just mentioned.
Yeah, Days of Thunder.
Seen. Yeah, True Romance, and then a whole bunch of Denzel Washington movies. Crimson Tide, Deja Vu, Man on Fire. Man on Fire was a good movie. Enemy of the State with Will Smith. So you've seen a million movies. You know, he died several years ago.
He died under weird circumstances too, man.
I thought it was suicide.
But they don't say it because he had a bunch of things in his system and he was recovering from cancer. And they don't seem to say he died by suicide. Yeah. But if you look at how he died, he jumped off a bridge, and that's like, I don't know, it's pretty textbook, but I don't know, it's strange. Like he had notes left, but his notes made no mention of his suicide, and he was in recovery from cancer. So I don't know. I think
it was a very unusual, very difficult, obviously, for Ridley Scott and the whole Scott family at the time. And you know, he was a very good director, and his movies look so, again, you look at that movie in 87, it looks amazing. Again, you just watched it, Ollie, like it looks like a much more modern movie especially when you compare it to Beverly Hills Cop 1, right? How does Beverly Hills Cop 2 hold up?
I still liked it. Beverly Hills Cop 2 was still good. Again, I can't subtract how much of a fan I was and continue to be in a way. So I'm like, yes, let's keep the journey going, right? And I think I remember it being one of those sequels with Lethal Weapon 2, and this one 1 and 2. I remember it being a very strong sequel then. Mm-hmm. And when I watched it, I was like, I still like it. And I think one of the greatest things it had going for it is the villains were particularly awful and contemptible.
Right.
And I remember Nielsen, that from Lethal Weapon did that too.
Right.
That South African guy who was
who had diplomatic immunity. I remember Lethal Weapon too. Yeah.
So they got you with these great criminals.
Yeah,
you know?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, but I remember Brigitte Nielsen at the time, I think, was dating or married to Sylvester Stallone.
What? Oh, she wasn't with Dolph?
No, I think that was later. She was definitely with Stallone around this time, but I know it gets confusing because she was also in Rocky 4. Yeah, I haven't seen it in years. I saw it in the theater. I totally remember seeing it in the theater. I remember being a lot of fun, but it's good to know that you thought it was still good. So after this, Eddie Murphy does a bunch of other movies, and he was actually offered a part in Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home, which is very strange if you've seen that movie, because I love that movie. And I'm like, what role would he have been in? But
do we not know?
It was actually the Catherine Hicks role, who was the love interest for Shatner, and they kind of rewrote that whole thing when Eddie Murphy said no. Yeah, apparently he liked Star Trek and he kind of was interested, but it just didn't work out. And then, you know, eventually they do Beverly Hills Cop 3, and I realized when I was preparing for this episode, I don't think I've seen it, because I watched some clips from it. I'm like, I don't think I've seen this movie. I remember it coming out and me thinking, why would I want to see this movie? Because it came out like 94 or something like that.
Wait, your thoughts were, why would I want to see this movie?
Yeah, because that's how much it had changed in like the 6 or 7 years since Beverly Hills Cop 2. I'm like, well, you're just trying to retread the same thing. And Eddie Murphy wasn't, now we're in the mid 90s. He's not the same as he was in the mid to late 80s. I know it doesn't seem like that, but I know that it doesn't seem like that makes sense, but that's just the way I felt personally. That's why I'm pretty sure I didn't see it. There sounded like there were some excellent ideas for Beverly Hills Cop 3 that were rejected. So one was him teaming up with Sean Connery as a Scotland Yard detective, and then he goes to London, which doesn't make any sense because he's from Beverly. It's like it's Beverly Hills Cop. And then another one where the Scotland Yard person would be played by John Cleese, which would, I mean, both of those ideas are amazing. Like, those are great pitches for a movie, but that didn't happen. So this one basically goes back to Beverly Hills. to investigate a murder. It has to do with like a amusement park, like a Disneyland kind of thing. And that's, I don't know, that's all I know about it. Did you ever see it?
I'm sure I did. I also cannot remember it. There's no world where I didn't see it, but I believe it was forgettable. You know why I know I saw it? Because looking at the cast of it, I was like, I know some of these people from this movie and absolutely nothing else. You know what I mean? Michael Bowen, Louis Lombardi, Rick Avery, Jimmy Ortega, Joey Travolta, John. I mean, these are people, they were not household names at all. And I think this movie did go down as one of his flops. There's no way I didn't see it. There's no way I didn't see it, but I did forget it. And as we talk about Eddie Murphy, again, not a career retrospective, but there have been some low points, shall we say. There have been films where you watched it and you were like, what did I just watch? Why did I watch it? Why was it made? And why did Eddie Murphy think he should do this? Eddie Murphy himself has said in interviews, he goes, there's some movies I regret doing. What do you got on that list? Give me a handful of your low points for
low points for him. It's funny. Do you remember he did this? So there's some I think he thinks are low points, but I don't think they are. Remember he did Best Defense with Dudley Moore?
I do not remember that at all.
I'd certainly watched that on VHS at someone's house. I don't remember it. I don't think that's one of his negative ones. Same thing. He didn't like The Golden Child. Love The Golden Child.
You love The Golden Child.
Tons of fun. It was tons of fun, like supernatural stuff. I Want the Knife. You guys have seen it. You know the joke I'm talking about. So what do I think are he thinks were failures? Probably Vampire in Brooklyn. I'm just going to say what I think was bad. I think The Nutty Professor, the first one, I didn't think was too bad. Nutty Professor 2, The Clumps, where he leans into all those other characters, I thought that was pretty bad. Adventures of Pluto Nash is supposed to be garbage. And I've heard that You People, which is this, I think it's a Netflix movie, where it's like, you watched it? I've heard it's trash. I'm curious what you say, because it's basically Eddie Murphy and his family getting together with, and because his daughter's getting together with Jonah Hill's character, and how the families interact, directed by Kenya Barris. I heard that was pretty bad. What do you? So
I found it a little bit corny. I found it a little bit corny, a little bit of a dated story. I didn't feel like it was relevant to anything happening. It wasn't connected to the times. That's what I'll say about that movie.
Oh, the other one is Horrible's Coming to America, like the sequel of Coming to America. It was so bad. It's so disappointing, because Coming to America is a great movie. That one I've certainly rewatched several times. Mm-hmm. It is a great movie, and oh God, it was so bad. It's so disappointed. And of course, this may be a bit worried about Beverly Hills Cop Axel F, but we'll talk about that in a second. What about you for his?
Well, your list has some of my my favorite awful movies. I will say I'm going to add Norbit to that. I really didn't like Norbit. I don't know if you remember Norbit, 2007.
It looked garbage.
It was. Daddy Daycare, not my thing at all.
My kids watch a lot of Daddy Daycare.
Did they really? Yeah.
They really like that. Yeah. They watch a lot of that.
Yeah. The Dr. Dolittle, I mean, you know, if you have children, okay, the first Dr. Dolittle, you can roll with it. But then again, Dr. Dolittle 2, what are you doing? What's happening here? It doesn't make any sense. And the movie Holy Man was not on your list, but that was awful. I don't know.
I never saw it. I heard it was bad. And let's just try and be a bit positive. First of all, he did the Shrek movies as Donkey. Amazing.
Yes.
I love Donkey. But there's ones that you guys may not have seen. One I mentioned before on this is A Bowfinger, which is 1999, Eddie Murphy and Steve Martin. That is a hilarious movie directed by Frank Oz. Frank Oz, again, the voice of Yoda. We talked about him on our Jim Henson episode.
Yeah.
That is a great movie. Definitely worth seeing. And Dolomite Is My Name from just a couple of years ago.
Really good.
Where it's a biographical comedy film. It was really, really well done. And, he gets... people forget that he can do dramatic work, and I thought that was good because it's funny, and he plays Rudy Ray Moore. It was well done. So those are ones I think I would recommend.
I would absolutely agree with Bowfinger. Dolomite Is My Name. I remember Boomerang being very good too.
I remember Boomerang being good too. He was more him like as a romantic lead. Yeah, that was
Yeah.
I liked it. I haven't seen it since the 90s, but I remember it being good too.
There's another movie. I don't know if you saw it. I don't know if you remember. It's called Life, 1999, and it's
Him
Eddie
and
Murphy,
Martin
Martin
Lawrence.
Lawrence. You remember this
Yeah, was
movie?
that good? No, I didn't. Never saw
I
it. Is it
thought
good?
it was. So they're, doing hard labor in Mississippi in the Jim Crow South.
Mm-hmm.
And then I don't know. It was like touching and comedic, which is I kind of like that. I like that little bit of heart in there. You know what I mean? Yeah, I think I would rewatch that. I would rewatch. I remember that.
Okay, so there we go. So yeah, we're not trying to be too harsh. And of course, Dreamgirls. He was great in Dreamgirls. Excellent. Now, of course, he didn't win the Oscar, and he famously walked out of the Oscars. But anyway, okay, we said we weren't going to get into a career retrospective of.
But now
of
what have
Eddie
we
Murphy.
done? Now look at us. We're
this.
fools.
Okay, let's talk about this fourth movie. So it's been in development since the mid '90s, since Beverly Hills Cop 3. Lots of drafts went back and forth, and Eddie Murphy basically said he wanted to make a fourth one because he thought the third one was horrible and he didn't want to leave the series on a low note. So then in the 2000s, Brett Ratner, who's the director of Rush Hour, was named as the director, and there's a debate whether there's going to be an R rating or PG-13 rating. Now, of course, since then, I believe Ratner has had a lot of Me Too allegations against him, so I don't know. So he wasn't really involved, but they were going to bring back other people from the series. So Judge Reinhold, John Ashton, Ronnie Cox, Bronson Pinchot would all come back. And so it seemed like he was on track for now we're talking about the late 2000s, early 2010s. And then Eddie Murphy said, no, he didn't want to do that. Instead, he wanted to produce a TV show starring Axel Foley's son, where Axel's the police chief of Detroit. And then so he would do the pilot and he'd show up every once in a while, but it would mainly be about his son. But the problem is, it's like the whole thing is a fish out of water play, right? So if I don't know why we said it in Detroit, but anyway. And then CBS passed on the TV series. So then,
no kidding. The Beverly Hills Cop series, where nothing happens in Beverly Hills.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense.
Doesn't make any sense.
And then 2013, it kind of was brought back, and then maybe Brett Ratner would be attached to it, and so it kind of went through all this development back and forth, and then eventually got to this reboot. So now we're talking like 40 years after the initial Beverly Hills Cop. So, Axel Foley is 63 in this movie, and it opens again, same thing in Detroit, and through various circumstances, he ends up back in Beverly Hills and reconnects with certain individuals from the first movie. I won't spoil how they are scattered throughout the plot. And of course, his daughter, is a bit of a spoiler, now is working in Beverly Hills and her connection to what he's investigating. And
that's not a spoiler. If you read the description of the movie, it would be in that description.
So we'll try and avoid any more spoilers, but Ali, what did you think of this Beverly Hills Cop 4?
I think there's one thing to be aware of, which is that time has not been kind to everybody, right? Some of the guys looking a little rougher around the edges. So you have to be
Judge Reinhold
ready
looks as old as John Ashton. They're like 20 years apart, but yeah.
Yeah, so you just have to be ready for that. Be a little accepting of the fact that people age naturally, and they get
especially because you just watched the first two movies.
I know,
and then
I think I had
later
to adjust more than anybody else.
Yeah.
Maybe just talking to myself, but you're exactly right. I watched them within a week of each other, and I was like, "Oh my gosh, time, cruel mistress, time." I thought, this is the other problem with watching them so close together. It's just like the exact same sort of beats, and you're like, "Oh gosh," because I just watched. The police chief was like going for a jog at the beginning of Beverly Hills Cop 2. He picks up some sand. There's something he's investigating. And right away, he's out. Something's going to happen to him. And they just copied that exact same model with Judge Reinhold. He's like, I'll call you back. I'm just in the middle of something. I'm working on something. And then it's like, okay, what was he working on? Oh, here's something right on his desk that is a big clue. It's very watch it with kids. You can watch it with kids. I mean,
there's nothing inappropriate in it for sure.
Nothing inappropriate. They don't go to a strip bar like they do in number 2, where I had to fast forward some parts.
I thought that was number 1. No.
Oh, was that number 1? My apologies. It was number 1. Of course, it was number one. But yeah, it was like extremely predictable. Not much of a sort of a thinker as far as like crime films go, right? And so if you know that, and if you accept that, and I did, I think it's a 6.5 to 7 on 10 entertaining movie.
Yeah, I would probably bump it up to 7 or 7.5, just my opinion. And I think it's because I appreciate what they wanted to do, but I also hadn't seen the older movies more recently, right? And so I was like, wow, they're trying to make an old school action comedy movie, which they have not done in a while. And still, like, Eddie Murphy isn't doing crazy stunts. You know, even when he's running, he's not running as fast. And they even make jokes about it, right? Like, the vehicles he steals to get away or chase the bad guys or whatever are like, it's pretty funny. I won't ruin what they are, but they're not the typical thing. So they are kind of making fun of that. And what I really liked about it is I thought it was funny. I thought it was actually slightly touching at some points, and they tied in a couple things, and they really thought about how would Axel Foley, as played by Eddie Murphy, have been as a father. Spoiler, not that good. And they leaned into that a bit, and they used all practical effects. There's so few computer generated effects in this movie. All the car crash, all the chases, a whole helicopter scene. Apparently, Ali, that was all done without CGI. Yeah, and so they really leaned into that. This was a director named Mark Malloy. He's mainly done commercials in Australia, and he actually even admitted he's only seen the first two Beverly Hills Cop movies. He's never seen the third one. And when he was being recruited for this job, they're like, "Yeah, don't watch that." And they use a lot of the same songs from the original first two movies in this. I thought it was pretty fun. We got Joseph Gordon-Levitt in it. I thought it was pretty fun. Is it amazing? No. I think this is a perfect streaming movie. So you're not going to be disappointed if you like the Beverly Hills Cop movies, but if you had to pay to watch this in a movie theater, you'd probably be pretty disappointed.
So that's a very interesting comment, because that was my first thought about action, blockbuster, geared at the people of a certain age who know, love, remember Eddie Murphy. We're the ones supposedly with disposable income. We would go to the theater. We remember the theater as being so tied to our life, right? We're people who still own televisions. That's who really loves Eddie Murphy. Why is this not in theaters? That was my first thing. When I saw it in Netflix, I'm like, this is a classic theater movie. I was a bit, but then I watched it and I had the exact same thing. I'm like, I'm pretty glad that wasn't in theaters.
Yeah, it would have been a bit of a downer, because in a movie that we go see in the big screen, in a movie that we see in the big screen, we're expecting crazy stunts like Tom Cruise in Mission Impossible doing all of his own stunts, insane set pieces, or special effects going, like Avengers, like crazy special effects, right? So people aren't used to this type of thing. And I think to put this at the level of, say, like a Fast and Furious or Mission Impossible, to do practical stunts, which they could have done, that probably would have made this like 2 or 3 times as expensive as it was. So I think this was the right call. I think overall it's a success. So I would encourage people, if you're interested in seeing it, to watch it. It's been doing pretty well. My understanding is on streaming. So yeah, I think check it out.
Check it out.
And it's hard to say, just how some things never change. And it's hard to find any strength to draw the line. Oh, I'm just burning, doing the new time dance. I'm just burning, doing the new time dance.
And as we encourage things and people to do things, I would encourage people not to get a meniscus tear in their knee. So let's talk a little bit about this, because it is something that's, I would say, common enough that I've heard about it my entire life. Since I was probably in my late teens, there have been meniscus injuries. So why don't we talk a little bit about the knee and what are the major sort of knee injuries, and why meniscus is one of them, and where does it rank? Is it the most common, and how many people get it, and how do you avoid it, Asif? You better have some avoidance strategies or I'm out of here.
Yeah, so these are all good questions. So it is definitely amongst the most common knee injuries. And of course, athletes are more likely to get these, but anybody can get them. And the risk increases as you get older. So again, this is kind of probably why Eddie Murphy got it. I don't know. Maybe he had played sports that day as well, but from the sound of it, he just turned in his bed. So when people talk about like a torn cartilage in their knee, that's usually a torn meniscus that they're talking about. There's other things that people can tear. These can be for other episodes. So, for example, you can get your ACL, which is your anterior cruciate ligament, which kind of goes diagonally across your knee. And then another common one that people can tear is the medial collateral ligament, which is on the inside of your knee, kind of that supports it from the side. So there's also something called the terrible triad. On Wikipedia, it says an unhappy triad. It's in medicine, at least in Canada, we call it terrible triads, but terrible is TEARABLE, but it's also terrible. And so these, because you can tear all of these together. So that's when someone says they blew out their knee, they often mean all of these things. So the ACL, MCL, and meniscus all getting damaged. And that's often a side hit to someone's knee. So football players, for example, rugby, these are the people who often will do all of these at the same time. But we'll just talk about just meniscal tears for today.
So far, I haven't heard any description of the knee. You're giving me a lot of credit that I'm very familiar. All I know about the knee is I've had these thoughts many times. If you believe in God, he didn't do the best job with the knee. Knee could have been stronger. A lot of knee injuries out there. That's what I know.
That's interesting. I think, now obviously we'll get to this, but strengthening of your leg muscles above and below the knee are obviously very important to prevent these things. But okay, so the knee. So we have two bones that meet to form the knee joint. Okay,
the knee bone's connected to the shin bone.
Sure, okay, that's fine. But the shin bone in this case would be the tibia.
Yes.
We also have our fibula down there, but we'll talk about the tibia. And then the femur is the one that's in your thigh, right? The bone that's in your thigh. So that's where these two are meeting. And then your kneecap sits in front of the joint to provide some protection. Okay,
the patella.
That's not in your knee joint, right? Yeah. That's your kneecap, right?
Yeah. Mine got loose during COVID. My patella.
Loosened patella. Yeah. And what'd you do? Just use a wrench and just tighten it up?
You got it.
Don't try this at home, everyone. Okay, so then you have these two wedge-shaped pieces of cartilage that are where these two bones meet. And these act as kind of like shock absorbers between these two, the femur and the tibia. So that's what a meniscus is. So menisci is the plural. And they help to transmit weight from one bone to another and help with knee stability, right? So you can imagine you might need a shock absorber. And if you had damage or wear on your meniscus, then you'd be getting more bone on bone kind of. So pretty common. In the US, it's about 61 per 100,000 people have meniscal tears. And so, but it's higher in certain populations. So obviously athletes, but even in the active military population, it's about 8 to 9 per 1,000. So pretty common. And in terms of risk factors, so male gender increases your risk of a meniscal tear, and being over 40 years old. Yikes.
I just feel like pressing pause on the podcast and doing a bunch of squats, knee bends.
Hey, I did legs this morning, guys.
Did you?
Worked out legs this morning. Yeah,
that's good. He means he walked up the stairs to his office. Okay, so how, as you said, this is an interesting thing that it can be caused by acute trauma or just being
old. Yeah, like degenerative disease over time.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
What happens when it actually tears? Is this a thing where you feel a pop or you hear a pop?
Exactly. Yeah, that's what people often feel. It's a pop that you kind of feel in your knee. And usually with a meniscal tear, you can still walk on it for a bit. So, for example, an athlete could hear the pop and then be able to keep playing with it. But then over 2 or 3 days, the knee becomes more stiff and swollen. So, the symptoms would be pain, stiffness and swelling, a catching or locking of your knee, or your knee giving way, and then just, like not being able to move your knee, like extend it fully or bend it fully. But sometimes you could have a pop and then an immediate effusion or swelling of your knee. That would be like a high impact hit, like for example in football. That is probably an ACL tear with a meniscal tear. In that case, the effusion develops pretty quickly, whereas the slow development of the swelling over a few days is more meniscal tear. So basically, if it's immediate, pop, swelling, you probably damaged the ACL.
You have double trouble.
Yeah, and then or maybe even the third terrible triad of the MCL as well. So when you're seeing your doctor, then they'll obviously look at your knee, but they can do something called the McMurray test. So they basically bend your knee and then straighten it. So like extending and flexing at the knee joint, but then they also rotate it, and they'll rotate it kind of, you can imagine that way with the rotation, it combined with the extension and flexion, you're kind of putting some pressure right in that meniscus. So medially will be the one that's kind of the inside of your leg, and laterally, your lateral meniscus would be the one on the outside of your leg. So he'll kind of rotate it towards either side while extending and flexing it, and then they'll see whether you get pain. And then they say you can get clicking or a clunking. In the bony world of medicine, like for orthopedic doctors, they talk a lot about clicks versus clunks. I don't know, man. I'm not an orthopedic doctor. I can never tell the difference. You feel something underneath your hands when you're moving these things. It's sometimes audible. I bet you a good orthopedic doctor can hear it. I can't, but you can kind of feel something. I can't tell the difference between a clicking or a clunking or whatever, but anyway, that's what they do. So then they can see if, taking through that range of motion can do that. So that's called a McMurray test when they do that.
Don't go to Asif Dojas with your clicking and clunking, please.
I don't know, clicking, clucking, clunking, I don't know.
Can it go untreated, or would that result? I mean, could you just sort of
Yeah, and that probably is what happens, is especially if you have the degenerative one, you just think you have knee pain over time, but it could get worse and worse over time. That's true. So usually they would suggest some sort of treatment, but we could talk about the different options for that.
Yeah.
By the way, I'm sure you're going to ask this, but in terms of how it's diagnosed, you can do x-rays. They're not the best, but usually you need an MRI scan to diagnose it. Some doctors may be able to just diagnose it clinically, like a good orthopedic doctor, but usually you'll get an MRI at some point to look and see about the tear.
I imagine somebody who knows the knee inside out would just do some of those, twists and rotations and be like, oh, you have this. But you don't, right?
Yeah, there's other tests you can do to look for your ACL and things like that. But again, we can talk about those another time. But,
you gotta pay off those MRIs though, right? You gotta invest in the investments. So you gotta get those. But yeah, okay. So what is the treatment then?
Yeah, it depends a bit about the type of injury, the location of the injury, and where it is. Like, so the outer 1/3 of the meniscus, okay, has a very rich blood supply. So that's called the red zone. So when it has a rich blood supply, and again, this is why MRI might be a bit more helpful to see exactly where the tear is, that can often heal on its own. You could have surgery, but it can often be repair on its own. But in contrast, the inner 2/3 of the meniscus lacks a significant blood supply. So without this blood supply, because it has such a limited blood supply, it can't really heal on its own, and the pieces can't really go back together. So usually just rest and whatever doesn't work. So you need to kind of to quantify where exactly it is. So I mean, again, you may not need immediate surgery, but the first thing they would recommend an orthopedic doctor would be the RICE protocol. The RICE protocol?
Rest, ice,
yes,
corn, and elephants. I can't forget. I can't remember, because I was like, where's the heat? Is it chaud? Is it French?
No.
Chaleur?
So it's compression is the C. Yeah, you wouldn't necessarily do heat at this point.
This is right after the injury. You go
exactly.
rice.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
So rest. Sometimes you need crutches. Ice is like cold packs for 20 minutes at a time, several times a day. Remember, don't put ice directly against your skin. Like use like some sort of like towel or something. Compression. So you can put an elastic.
And E is elevate.
E is elevate. Exactly. Yeah. So it has to be higher than your heart.
Yeah.
So these are things that don't involve surgery. So that might be part of it. Taking a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory, we call those NSAIDs. So what are those? Ibuprofen, naproxen, right? So Aleve, Motrin, Advil, things like that. And sometimes you may need a steroid injection to help eliminate pain and swelling. So that would be the conservative thing. Again, your doctor could be an orthopedic doctor, could be a sports medicine doctor, could be your family doctor or emerge doctor. They will recommend what they would suggest for each of these situations. And then you could end up having surgery though, right? Especially if it's in this area. the inner 2/3 where they don't have a significant blood supply, the doctor may say, okay, actually, we should probably go for surgery.
You skipped from rice to surgery very quickly. There was quite a jump.
No, that's why I said non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, and a middle ground is like a steroid injection, right? So, but again, like resting, and for a lot of people, they can heal on their own, especially if it's the more minor outer.
This is very interesting to me because a lot of the conventional talk around healing from stuff like this is to rest, right? Stay off your leg, this kind of thing. But now there's this idea of like increasing blood flow to an injured area with either heat or with light exercise, eventually more, intense exercise, gets the blood flowing to that area and helps.
Yeah, there's a balance. There's also the idea that if you don't move a limb a lot, then you can develop stiffness in that limb. So I would say that's fine, but you should be doing this under the guidance of a doctor or like a physiotherapist. Don't just start, I'm going to start going for a light jog, because I want to get the blood flow going. You have to do it.
Yeah, I'm talking about stretching. I was not talking about jogging at all. That sounds insane.
But again, these are things you should probably be talking to. I would recommend anybody who is having this issue, go see a physiotherapist. They would definitely be able to instruct people on the correct way to do things. But I was mentioning some people need to get surgery. So you've probably heard or seen people who've had a knee arthroscopy. So that's like a scope of your knee. So they do they do a small incision, put a miniature camera in there, and then they can do surgery on it. So they can either trim part of the meniscus or just repair the tear. And so a partial meniscectomy, probably not saying that properly, is with the trimming of part of it. And this will allow for immediate weight bearing and a full range of motion soon after the surgery. So again, I'm not an expert in this, but I think for more minor issues and depending on where it is, they might opt for that. And then sometimes you need to do a full meniscal repair. And then so they actually suture, like stitch up the torn pieces. And depending on where it is and the overall condition of the meniscus and the type of tear, it depends whether you can get that or not. So, and of course, it will take time to heal and to like kind of fuse together after the suturing. So that takes a longer time to heal. So probably the decision to do those depends on the type of injury, like we said, where it is, how the blood supply would be to this area, and how soon people want to get back on to doing what they were doing before. So that, again, it's a decision that people would make in conjunction with their orthopedic doctor.
Shake down, break down, take down. Everybody wants into the crowded line. Break down, take down. You're busted. Let down.
So that's our episode for today. Let us know what you guys thought about it. I know we said we weren't going to do a career retrospective of Eddie Murphy, and somehow we ended up doing that. Let us know, did we miss anything? Do you guys feel the same way about the Beverly Hills Cop Axel F movie? Let us know, drvcomedian@gmail.com, Dr. V Comedian on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. We are everywhere. And reach out to us. Let us know what you thought about our past couple episodes. A lot of feedback about the Michael Jackson episode. Hopefully a lot of people listen to the Tell Them You Love Me episode. I think Ali and I really enjoyed doing that one. Very, very interesting documentary and lots of stuff to talk about. But reach out to us. Let us know. Ali, what do you got going on? We're talking end of July, August.
We're talking hernia surgery. Yeah. We're talking chilling out. We're talking trying not to eat or drink too much while I recover from hernia surgery. And then on my website, you can see shows, upcoming dates, and things.
Sounds good. But remember that although I'm a doctor, I'm not your doctor. Medical issues we talk about for your interest and information only, and they're not medical advice. Please consult your medical professionals for actual medical advice. Thanks for listening.
Bye.
Thank you.